I want tonight to deal with some issues around policy, race, politics, and theology. Because I don't know any way to read the scriptures and not deal with those issues. I don't know any way of reading the scriptures without holding the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. I don't know any way of talking about scripture and God that is society ducking and issue denying. That's what prophetic preaching is, and that's what this Banny conference is about, and thanks to the founder of this conference. In fact, there's a book, I was talking to Alan Bosak about it up at CTS, and in that book, Alan Bosak with some others says the temptation of a politically pietistic reconciliation is a cheap form of reconciliation. It's not biblical reconciliation, but indeed political accommodation that becomes a holy grail being pursued at the cost of justice and the cost of the poor. Kind of like now everybody just wants to just give him a chance, just don't criticize. They go on to say, like Christian quietism, it approaches the language of reconciliation. It speaks of political forgiveness, social consensus and social contract, civility, and political correctness, but it is void of justice, equity, and the necessary disturbance that the gospel must engage. It remains an exclusionary pact among the most powerful, not seeking genuine transformation driven by justice, and in the process becomes an embodiment of the very contradiction it accuses Christian reconciliation of obfuscating and denying. In other words, when you cry peace, peace, where there is no peace, then actually that cry is a violation of our Christian faith rather than upholding it. When I was at Duke studying theology, Dr. William Turner said it like this. He said, to be a Christian or the person of faith is to have a crisis conversion or a conversion of crisis, either way. A crisis conversion. He said that you can call it what you want, saved, sanctified, baptized, born again, washed in the blood, picked up, turned around, sat on your feet. But if whatever happened to you doesn't produce a quarrel with the world, if it doesn't produce a critique of injustice and a suspicion of the empire, then your claim to have had a spiritual conversion remains terribly suspect. There is a text in the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel that I want to build this lecture and preach lecture around. And it says, so all the elders of Israel gathered together. They came to Samuel at Ramah and said, you old, and we want a king just like Russia. Excuse me, wrong center. I'm sorry. Sometimes between, BC and AC, y'all hush. We want a king just like all the kings of other nations. Now, Samuel wasn't pleased when they said, give us a king to lead us. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to everything the people are saying to you. Give them what they want. Because you are not the one they have rejected. I am the one they have rejected. And to these people, this is nothing new. This is out of the Message Bible. They are doing just what they have always done. They've always deserted me and served other gods. They've always engaged in injustice. They've done it from the very time I brought them out of Egypt up to this day, and now they are deserting you too. Let them have what they want, but do not give up your prophetic role to warn them. Let them know what the king who rules over them will expect to be done for him. And Samuel did what the Lord said. Samuel, they have not rejected you. They have rejected me. And tonight I want to talk about resiliency, revival, and redemption after rejection. Here is the story of rejection, the rejection of Samuel by the people who were so greatly indebted to Samuel. His very name means asked of God. They owed him their political independence and their deliverance. He was the bridge between the last judge Samson to the present moment. Samuel, in some way, was the founder, the second founder of the nation. When he came into office, things were so bad economically, so bad socially, and he became the prophet that God called. He was like a second father to his country. He served them many years. And one writer says, under his wise administration, Israel had come to be powerful, but also orderly and peaceful. They were well governed, prosperity was returning, and Samuel was not someone who had suddenly come to power. It was hard for Samuel to even get here. You know, his mother had been barren, and Hannah had to beg to God for a child, and God wouldn't give her the child until she said, Lord, if you give it to me, I'll give the child right back to you. Samuel had been called as a child. Samuel had been with them from Dan to Bathsheba. They knew that Samuel was established to be the prophet of the Lord. That's all in chapter 3, 1 Samuel. Samuel had grown up in their midst. We don't read anything about Samuel saying, I know I can be a prophet. I'm the one to lead you. I and I alone can save you. No, if anything, Samuel was kind of cool, calm, and collected. Even when God called him, he didn't say, hey, God, I knew you were going to call me. He questioned it. He didn't say, God, I know you need me because I'm really the one you've been looking for, God. He resisted. He came into power slowly. And for 20 years, he served and he was content. At the very time that most men get ambitious, they get a direct call from the Lord. There's some folk in this city, they'll ask you to pay for them a plane because the Lord told them. You can't trust most folk with a direct call from the Lord because they will use that for prosperity. But Samuel wasn't like that. And so their rejection of him was to reject one of the best men God had ever brought to serve a country. 30 years he had served the nation, and now he was rejected. And he was rejected for an authoritarian king because that's what they wanted. And Samuel is dejected because of the rejection. But God exegetes the situation and first reminds Samuel with assurance that this did not happen because of anything you did. The people clamored for this change because deep inside of them, they don't want to follow God anyhow. This change is not about you, Samuel. It's the justice of Jehovah. It's the ways of God that they are dissatisfied with. This is important because many times people who serve because they love justice and love people, when things don't go right, we start suspecting ourselves. Maybe I didn't have the right faith. Maybe I didn't believe. We question our own conduct. What could we have done differently? Maybe the election, something would have turned out differently. But there comes time when God says, no need for that, because you may be dealing with the people who are determined to overthrow progress and the ways of justice. And they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. They no longer wanted to be restrained by the cause of justice. They wanted to be like other nations. So God rehearses before Samuel their conduct. He says, first of all, don't act like this is new for this nation. They did it to Moses. They did it to Aaron. They've done it to every prophet. They've done it to every move forward. And God says to Samuel, give them what they want. But just because you give them what they want does not mean then you can resign yourself. You must still be prophet. God does not say to Samuel, give them what they want and stop being prophet. In fact, Samuel's role as prophet and prophetic voice grows because there's an authoritarian king now. It grows even the more. It is more necessary for the prophetic now to be a continual check and critique on the new king. Partly to try to help him to do right, but to challenge him when he does wrong. This is a moment in America, my brothers and sisters, where our faith in God and our understanding of the prophetic role of faith must be real. This is a moment in America where we must remember in this moment how our ancestors responded to disappointment and rejection without allowing it to deter them from the march towards justice. This is a moment. My friend Jean Theo Harris is writing a new book. She wrote the book, The Radical Life of Rosa Parks. She's writing a new book about the truths about the movement, because we need to understand movements of the past that brought us many of the things we hold dear in the present were hard and often face much rejection. And in this moment, many of us need to read how people we call our heroes responded to rejection. Like, what did Frederick Douglass do when Dred Scott's decision came down and people told him his efforts were useless and it was over? Read his sermon after the Dred Scott decision. Yeah. Because how did our folk in the past, black and white, how did William Lloyd Garrison, a white minister, stay true after he was locked up, not in the South, but in Boston, to protect him from a respectable mob that wanted to hang him for preaching the sinful gospel that all men were created equal? How in the midst of false prophets are there always some who remain true? This right now is something we must recognize and deal with in America, because right now we're going to have to be honest about the depth of racism and psychic moral sickness of this nation that still exists. And as ugly as it is, we must see it openly and clearly. But this is also the place where we must redouble our commitment to be instruments of truth, love, and justice. And this is where tonight and in the days to come, we must understand what God told the prophet Samuel. They are not rejecting you, but they are rejecting my way, and I still need you to be prophet. Like Samuel, we must keep on being the prophetic voice and the vision that God has called us to be. And so we must understand that this rejection election doesn't change our calling. In fact, we must understand, all faiths, that the prophetic role doesn't ask anyway, can our vision be implemented? Walter Brueggemann says that vision is of no consequence till it can be imagined anyway. And the first role of prophetic faith is to have the kind of hope that is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. Our job is always to push a hope that is subversive. He says that limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that even in the present there's always a new future on the way. But that hope can't be optimism that goes around the pain. No, the role of the prophet is to bring to public expression the dread of endings, the collapse of our self-madness, the barriers and the pecking orders that secure us at each other's expense, and the fearful practice of eating at the table of a hungry brother and sister. In other words, the role of the prophetic is to engage in the dangerous ministry of telling the truth. And in telling the truth, we must keep on conjuring up alternative futures and refusing to accept what is when we know that what is not what God wants. So right now, we are seeing some things that we would rather not see. And I wasn't going to say this, but I think y'all could handle it. So I'm going to say it anyhow and leave if I need to. But I know that many of you on Wednesday morning, November the 9th, 2016, said the same thing that Jesus said when he saw a fig tree that was faking the funk and wouldn't produce. Jesus looked at that fig tree and said, "Damn." And I know why you laughing, because that's what you said Wednesday morning, November the 9th. What in the world just happened? But I want to let you know, I believe this moment in America is ultimately now not about Trump or Clinton or Obama, but it's really about the rejection of some things much deeper. On January 20th, we said farewell to the first African-American president, who, a man of integrity and dignity, a man who had to endure obstruction, who had to endure being called everything but a child of God, a man who was questioned when he simply tried to help his wife's dress stay down while she was walking up into Air Force One, and now we got a stripper in the White House. utter contradictions. He couldn't even fist bump his wife without being criticized. And now somebody else can be caught on tape talking about what they're grabbing. Obama couldn't have even thought what this president has done. He couldn't have even put it in his mind. He had to endure more attempts and more assassination plots than any other. He had to endure people trying to fight him even when he was trying to help people. He's been called everything, but up until January 20th, he was called Mr. President. We had to bid farewell to a man whom this country, some ways, like Samuel, had been asked for 400 years. The sons of slaves had built the White House, and then here he comes, the son of an African, the son of a white woman from Kansas, and this was not the Wizard of Oz. And he got to live, a black man with a black wife with black children in a White House built by slaves. He pulled us up out of recession. He attempted to do what Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, proposed to do in 1912 with health care. Now, he hadn't done everything right. I don't mean to suggest that either. There were some things we wish he would have done more. There were some things we had to be deeply critical about with him as well. We've had our disagreements. He even said that if Dr. King was alive, somebody said, President Obama, would Dr. King be voting for you? He said, no, Dr. King would be pushing me. But in so many ways, he tried, given the hand he was given, with the obstruction he wanted. He really wanted universal health care, but he tried, and we ended up with the Affordable Care Act, and we bid him witness. And we bid him farewell, and we had to bid him farewell and then witness the inauguration of a con artist. One writer called vulgarity at its height. And I'm here tonight as a preacher to say we elected someone who did little to spurn endorsements, even by the forces of xenophobia and white supremacy. KKK endorsed him. And though it is impossible to react to this moment with anything less than profound anxiety and revulsion, this moment reveals that some have rejected some very serious principles that are far deeper than just Republican versus Democrat. It really exposes a deep moral deficit. One of those things that this moment reveals that we've rejected moral statesmanship and dignity for buffoonery and gamesmanship. To elect a president whose disdain for women and minorities and civil liberties and scientific fact, to say nothing of simple decency, has been repeatedly demonstrated that we are rejecting something much deeper, which is why Trump is vulgarity unbounded, whose election strikes fear into the hearts of the vulnerable. This is what one editor wrote. The weak and above all, the many varieties of others in this country feel deeply insulted and around the world. The African-American other, the Hispanic other, the female other, the Jewish other, the Muslim other. He took mainstream things that all Americans know, if she would be honest, that if Obama had done one of them, he would have never made it out of the primary. That's a much deeper discussion. It's not about me endorsing any candidate. I'm talking about the state of our society. Can you imagine President Obama starting his campaign, calling Mexican racist and saying he was going to build a wall between us and Canada or us and Mexico? Trump ran his campaign sensing the feeling of dispossession, one writer said, and anxiety among millions of voters, white voters in the main. And one writer said many of those voters, not all, but many followed Trump because they saw a slick performer, once a relative cipher when it came to politics. He was more than willing to assume their resentment, their fury, their sense of a new world that conspired against their election. And his election shows that we have in some ways in this nation rejected moral statesmanship and dignity, and have settled for buffoonery and gamesmanship. But this moment we're in also reveals that in many places we have rejected real answers to real issues for lies. That far too many in this nation would rather be lied to. We've seen now that some would rather that be the case. Trump articulated fears rooted in racism and classism. He offered no answers. He merely lifted fears and said, you are right to be very, very afraid. And more are coming that look like Obama, and I alone can save you. Now, I did a little biblical trace of that. The only people that talk like that, I alone in the biblical, were Nebuchadnezzar, Caesars, and Herod the Greats. It's a kind of political idolatry to stand up and say, I alone. Sarah Sabatia wrote an article entitled, With a Snarl, Trump Ratifies His Supporters' Rage. She's with Tufts University, and in that she says, she calls it the outrage, or she has another author, Jeff Barry, who talks about the outrage industry. There are folk that just make money off of outrage. And it says in that article, for a constituency that feels misunderstood and resentful, political silence by critics who deem their silenced by critics who deem their views as racist, sexist, homophobic, or simply problematic, Trump offered dignity, voice, visibility without shame. She goes on to say, they felt as though they have been cheated and they wanted someone to be held accountable, but instead of shaking their fists at global capital, their hostilities point downward at women, people of color, and recent immigrants and Muslims whom they see as having taken that which should have rightly been theirs. And you see, my friends, the problem with that is that it's a con game rooted in lies. And far too many have rejected real answers or real issues for lies. Because here's the truth, there are real economic fears. They didn't start with Obama. They didn't even start with Bush in the recession. They've been going on ever since we deconstructed the war on poverty from the 1968. In fact, they've gone on in the country even from its founding. From its founding, we had economic problems because we said only those who had a certain amount of wealth could even vote. There are real economic fears. We are the richest and the poorest nation both at the same time. They're real fears. Our child poverty rates are a sin against God in the wealthiest country in the nation. And they exist and they're deeply disparate. 10 of the country's 12 poorest states are in the South. Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, Mississippi. And it's real, but it's also real that the poorest counties in America, 95 of them, are in so-called red states led by and represented by politicians who are the most ardent opponents of the programs that will help the poor. There are real issues. Joseph Stiglitz, in his book, The Price and Cost of Inequality, declares that we live in a time now where the 400 of the wealthiest Americans take home an hourly wage of $97,000 an hour. $97,000 an hour, while we are locking people up who simply want 15 at a minimum wage. And the 15 will be obsolete by next year because if the minimum wage had kept rate with inflation since the 60s, the minimum wage would be $22 an hour. These are real issues. Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health found out that poverty, low levels of education, poor social support, and other factors contribute to more death than heart attack, strokes, and lung cancer every year. More people die from poverty than die from strokes. 245,000 a year in 2009. It's gone up since then. So there are real problems. There are many things that Obama, Democrats, Republicans, Independents need to address. There are real problems with those without health care. In the South, there's so many people without health care, and yet the South and the southern states have been the ones the most opposed to health care. That's also true. Medicaid. Right here in this state, many people who claim to love Jesus, who set up free health clinics everywhere he went. right here in this state. They've denied Medicaid expansion to over 600,000 people, the majority of them white, but they racialize what Medicaid expansion is really about, and have denied over 70,000 jobs right here in Georgia. Yeah, real problems. But you see, lying to people and simply saying it's other folks' fault and blaming it on other people, that's not the answer. That's why we're in this mess right now about health care, because too many people have decided to accept the lie than the truth. A guy was on TV, maybe you've seen it on Google the other day, and he was arguing about Obamacare. He didn't like Obamacare, he didn't like Obamacare, he didn't like Obamacare. And you know, there's a reason why they call it Obamacare, not the Affordable Care Act, right? And so after he finished fussing about Obamacare, the guy said, the interviewer said, well, do you have health care? He said, yeah. He said, I have the Affordable Care Act. Yeah. Somebody been lied to, and somebody's choosing to accept lies. The truth of the matter is, I wish we hadn't have had the conversation about the Affordable Care Act. What we need is universal health care. Health care ought to be a human right for everybody. But then all these lies about Obamacare, Affordable Care is not in a death spiral. It's been sabotaged. 31 states that didn't expand Medicaid. We would have had 8 million more people on health care. And those states that denied expanding Medicaid are the same states that have voter suppression for the most part, and where 6 out of 10 African Americans live, even though there would have been more whites in that 8 million that would have been helped. The truth is, it's a lie when a representative stands up and says, the poor shall be with you always, as a justification. He ain't even quoting the scripture right. The scripture from Deuteronomy 15 says, there should be no poor among you. And then it goes on to describe that the poor will always be among you because there will always be nations and rulers that will not help the poor and will do everything to hurt the poor. It's a lie when you say that the only folk that ought to have health care is those that work. That's why you sick sometimes. Why you can't work, because you're sick. It's a lie. Health care should be a right. But when people reject the truth and real answers for real issues and accept a lie, then we end up in this place, which leads us to another kind of rejection. And that's the rejection that flows out of the lies. It is a rejection of what would fix the problem and the acceptance of fear. And we saw that work out in this last election. You remember when Trump brought up poverty in front of a white audience and started talking about black people? And most of the media, Dr. Brown, didn't know how to deal with that. They didn't understand what was going on. What was really going on is subliminally he was saying, you know, black people are not just people with problems, they are problem people. That's why I was in an all-white audience talking about black people. You find that language in W.B. Du Bois, and then later on, Cornel West picked that up. And what he was really saying is if they would listen to us, we would cut taxes and help them, but because they will not listen, that's why they're poor. That's what he was saying with what do you have to lose? It was a way of actually simply causing a white audience to be fearful of black people when in fact there are actually more white people that are poor than there are black. Dr. King had to deal with this kind of displaced fear. You remember Dr. King, 50 years ago, he talked about America needs a Marshall Plan. And Dr. King said we need it for poor people in white Appalachia, and poor blacks in the Delta, and poor blacks in the urban area, and poor whites who've all lost their job. He said, and he preached, and he talked about because now we're all in the same boat. Dr. King was trying to overcome the fear that keeps us from doing what we need to do. And we need to address fear-mongering. And the reason we need to do it is, how do you deal with poverty? You know, how do you really deal with poverty? Well, if you want to deal with poverty, here's how you do it. We don't need fear, we need facts. If you want to deal with poverty, ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, strong safety nets for the poor, fair and just policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, and cease war baiting where we spend more money blowing up people than fixing up communities. You want to deal with poverty? You really want to deal with poverty? Don't make people afraid of each other. Let's talk about every child receiving a high quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education with access to college. You want to deal with poverty? Let's make sure we have health care for every person, starting with saving the Affordable Care Act, but then moving on to universal health care and guaranteeing Medicaid and Medicare. And let's protect women's health, and let's protect the environment, and let's face climate change and deal with it. You want to deal with poverty? Let's change the disparities in the criminal justice system that affect black, brown, and poor white people. And let's, as Michelle Alexander said, overturn the prison industrial complex. You want to deal with poverty? Let's protect and expand voting rights and labor rights and women's rights and immigrant rights and LGBTQ rights, and recognize that everybody has a right to equal protection under the law. But then that leads, why can't we have that conversation? Well, it leads to another thing in this moment that's been exposed that we've been rejecting for a while. We have rejected true evangelicalism, and we've instead accepted and embraced a form of theological malpractice and heresy called white evangelicalism. And Jim Wallace, who's an evangelical and who's white, in his book, America's Original Sin, says that if you listen closely to those who claim to be far-right white evangelicals, he said it's really a euphemism for white, and mainly white men who mad. And we've seen a rejection of true evangelicalism. Some said, that they endorsed Trump. They said, we endorse him because we're evangelical. One of them said they endorsed Trump because he was a baby Christian. Well, I want to say, what in the heaven you doing giving a baby Christian a job like president? I mean, that's like making a baby the pastor of the church. Come on now. Another one said, and this stuff would make you laugh if it wasn't so bad. It said that one said that he represented all of the tenets of family life and morality. Another one, I think this was a black white evangelical, because you got them too, Yeah, you got a lot of them around here. But anyway, one of them actually said that his greed and his shrewdness was an adoring quality. Yeah, preacher. Another one says, and I really like this answer because he kind of told the truth. He said, I just want the meanest son of a gun to get power and then use it for what we want. But all of these things show that there's this rejection of true evangelicalism and the true moral values of faith. And it's an assault on the fundamentals of faith. And what has helped over the years to shape the moral conscience of this nation and the world and change things when they needed to be changed. It's an assault on the faith tradition that has historically helped America address such issues like slavery and lynching and segregation and discrimination and economic injustice and caring for the poor. And instead, it was almost like we've gone back and sampled the religion of the slave master, brought it into the 21st century. Yeah, folk have rejected. They've rejected true biblical conservatism. That's why everywhere I go, I tell folk I am a theologically evangelical, conservative, liberal, liberationist, charismatic biblicist. In other words, I know Jesus for myself. Because this sort of cherry picking the easy parts of Christianity is not a new practice. A few years ago, we had to write Franklin Graham and ask him, had he ever read the Bible? Since there are over 2,500 scriptures in the Bible that deal with how you treat the least of these, poor and justice and love, there's only about 3 scriptures that even support most of the stuff the so-called white, they say all you got to do is be against gay people and be against abortion and be for prayer in the school and be for property rights and be for gun rights, and the Lord loves you. And then they get some of us, we get so hung up, I'm talking us black folk, get so hung up on sex. I've never seen folks so, you get talking about it too much, you must have a fetish. Every sermon, all you're doing is putting down gay people that may not. Especially when there aren't but about 3 scriptures that even speak to it, and none of them trump this scripture. You must love your neighbor as yourself, and that all of us have been created in the image of God. Now, to be quite honest, I want to talk about sex from the pulpit. Oh, yes, I want to talk about sex. And the prophets love to talk about sex. You go over there and read Hosea. Hosea talked about when a nation goes a-whoring after other gods. See, the kind of sex I want to talk about that sex that had to happen between the Supreme Court and the wealthy, greedy oligarch that went in the back seat or the back room and produced the bastard child called Citizens United. That's I want to talk about that unholy sex that's going on right now in Congress, that's going to go on all night long, so that in the morning they can try to produce an unholy, take health care away death bill. That's the sex. We've seen a rejection of true evangelicalism. And it has undermined our moral conversation in the public square. Now, David Grimm, can I just lecture for a minute, huh? Okay. David Grimm has written a book called The Blessings of Business, How Corporations Shape Conservative Christianity. And in his books, he says we have to wrestle with so-called, I don't like to use conservative, I'll tell you why later, so-called conservative evangelicals, and actually and what it is, which is simply a religious identity shaped by money, power, and corporate executives. And he says if you understand this, then you'll understand why so-called white conservative and blacks, otherwise evangelicals, fandom for a tycoon and a top-down authoritarian. Or you need to read Kevin Cruz's book on how the pulpit was bought, called One Nation Under God. And let me tell you that story real quick. See, they hated Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he was doing, but they couldn't challenge him because in the Depression, the business community had become so hated and they lost their credibility. They actually hated what began starting during the late 1800s with that question, what would Jesus do? That wasn't about, drinking some drink or smoking a cigarette. It was about what would Jesus do if he saw children walking around with 3 fingers cut off because there was no children's labor law? What would Jesus do if he saw men falling out with heart attacks because they were forced to work 60 hours a week with no ventilation, no health care? What would Jesus do if he saw women being forced to work for no minimum wage and being raped on the job? What would Jesus do? And the social gospelists raised that. And they started talking about the social sins that killed Jesus. If you want to really know what's took him to the cross, talking about greed and the mob spirit and things like that make up what they call the constitutionality of the kingdom of evil. And so by the time we get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, God had placed Frances Perkins, a social gospeler, a woman. First Labor secretary was a woman, but she was a social gospeler. And she was pushing. And it was creating too much change, Social Security. Now, it wasn't all good because it still was marred by racism, but it was pushing. And the greedy corporations didn't like it. They didn't want labor. They didn't want to pay folk 25 cents an hour. That's too much. Because that's what the first minimum wage was, 25 cents an hour. They didn't want to pay that. They didn't want to have to give people health care and Social Security. They cut a deal. They said to Franklin, okay, we'll accept some of this. Some of the senators from the South said that we'll accept some of this, but this is what you got to do. You got to make sure people in the agrarian culture and the domestic culture can't get it, because that means black and brown people can get it and our white women can get it. And we don't want our white women to get too uppity. So when the first Social Security was passed, 50% of white women couldn't pay in. So these corporations they tried to argue against them. They created these different groups, the American Liberty Society, but they had no credibility, so they outsourced the job. They did a study, and the study, they found out that the people who had the most credibility were preachers. And many of those preachers were preaching, though, the social gospel. And they could not stand it. So they hired a guy by the name of James Fifield out in California, who said his goal was to debone the gospel and preach the easy part, and they put money behind them. The National Manufacturers Association, the National Chamber of Commerce, General Motors, and other folk put money, billions and millions of dollars, and in 10 years he had bought 19,000 pulpits. And he was teaching them to preach this. It's a weird theology. It goes like this: if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. So if you're good and you live a certain way and you have a right kind of faith, you'll have money. Now I'm talking 1930s, 1940s, 1945, 50. And if you're bad, if you don't have money, it's because you're bad, because you don't know the right faith and you're not living according to a certain way. So therefore, it's wrong for government, even though government helped create poverty, it's wrong for government to do any program to help you up when you're poor, because if government helps you up, then you won't live right. So therefore, any program that helps people up is a form of social atheism. Yeah. And that's some of what we are seeing today. And we got to understand what's been rejected. True evangelical and true biblicism. And I don't claim to know everything, but I've never been so glad in my life that my grandmama made me sit on her knee and read the book. Lord, have mercy, Jesus. And I read most of them, the Quran and the Torah, but I'm so glad I read the book, because I come from a Bible-thumping family. See, y'all don't know anything, these young folk. We had to read the book. We couldn't even eat chicken till we quoted scripture. How many of y'all know about that? Remember that? Huh? Talk to me. And I'm so glad I had to read the book, because I can't find anything in the book that says your major concern ought to be tax cuts for the wealthy, giving money to private school, hating on people because of their sexuality. But I can find in the book in Deuteronomy that you're supposed to care for the stranger. I can find in the Psalms that relieving the poor and the oppressed is what puts us on God's side. I can find in Jeremiah 22, go down to the king's palace and tell him to do right and do justice. I can find in Isaiah 10 in the book, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. I can find in the book in Ezekiel 49 that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed not because of the mess we hear, but because they wouldn't take care of the poor and the needy. I can find God asking Ezekiel, who can I get to stand in the gap when the leaders have become like rabies-infested wolves who are destroying the people with their politics? I can find Jesus in his first sermon saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he hath called me to preach good news, that's evangel, to the poor, that's patokos in Greek, those who have been made poor by systemic evil. And then I find it at the end of his life, on his way to the cross, where he says, I know you're going to preach some sermons and you might wear a robe or two, you might have a nice church, but when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you care about me? I can find that. And this is true evangelicalism. And anything less is theological malpractice and hypocrisy. Yeah, we've rejected so much. We've rejected common sense for craziness. But then there's one more thing, and that is the rejection that we have rejected having a real understanding of racism and how it intersects with everything else. Neil Painter, the professor of history at Princeton, has written a piece, you ought to read it, called Without Obama, There Would Be No Trump. And if we don't wrestle with this, we misunderstand this whole election. She says that the election of Trump is the iconographic of a tragic, traditionally American call and response. The call is a challenge to the status quo. And wherever that call goes out, the response is an outbreak of meanness, vile rhetorical weapons, and reclamation to try to go back to an easier time. She goes on to say that today's challenge to white people on top is the most acute in history. The election and re-election of a president who is black with a wife who is black. She wrote this before the election. And 2 daughters who are black. The responses to this call began early. It didn't begin with Trump. It began with the vile. She says, I hear people, and I talk about how we hear people now talking about respecting Trump. President Obama was, by some, never respected. It didn't start with Trump. It started with the vow to make Obama a one-term president. It started with the vow not to let him be successful in anything. It started with birtherism, that the people who should have checked it didn't check it. It started when a South Carolina congressman stood up on the floor of the United States Congress and didn't call him a liar. He said, you lie. That's a different word. Not you are a liar. You lie. Your existence, you being there, is a lie. Yeah. Listen at the countless visual stereotypes we heard long before this election that someone we thought had lost their currency. She goes on to talks about, she says that when they called him juvenile. That's the same word the slave masters called the slave. The reason we got to enslave these people because they're juvenile. Yeah. And then lastly, he wasn't just black, he was willing to embrace immigration reform because, see, they may have accepted a black person if it was a black person that would do and say all the things they want him to say, Ben Carson. I mean, they would. And I don't say that sarcastic. Ben Carson operated on my doctor. My baby, I will forever love him for that. He operated on her when she was 1.5 years old and helped. But even now, she wants to meet with him because she does not understand, how do you operate on me with a brain disorder and save my life, and then you don't support health care that allows people with pre-existing conditions? My daughter, she went on to say this: Trump is so obviously unsuited for the job of president, but he is the nominee most suited to answer the call of responding to the challenge of the status quo. Yeah, Robin DiAngelo, a professor of multicultural education at Westfield State, he describes what happened in this election as white fragility. He says white fragility is when the minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensiveness. And then there is a function to reinstate white equilibrium. If you don't understand this, and what we are rejecting, which is a real honest focusing on the continuing existence of racism, then you don't understand why it is that 94% of black women voted for Hillary. And I'm not endorsing, I'm just pointing out some stats. But 58% of white women voted for Trump even after he said all this stuff. If you don't understand this, you don't understand why only 8% of African Americans and 66% of white women said that they were not afraid after all of this. 79% of white men said, I'm not afraid, but only 28% of black women said they're not afraid. What's going on here? We have to recognize the centrality of race and racism, America's original sin, that still impacts our social DNA. The continuing reality of racism and classism that are connected together. And we are required in the moral faith community to unpack these two sins, these two sins, as Dr. King called them. There's 3 of them: racism, classism, and militarism. Well, one author says it like this from Duke: the problem is we sometimes think the only time we see racism is when somebody calls us the N-word. But there's a book you ought to read called Racism Without Racist, where the author says we are virtually out of racists today. He said, but only the willful deaf cannot hear the dog whistle politics. When you call the president a juvenile, a socialist, un-American, those are dog whistles. Dog whistles. And here's the grown-up conversation, Dean, that theological schools and universities are going to have help us have about racism together, black and white together. If there are 18.9 million poor whites as of 2013, that means that there are 8 million more poor whites than there are poor blacks. And there are 5 million more poor white people than there are Latinos. And the majority of people benefiting from programs like food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare are white. But in those counties where you have majority white, 95% of the politicians who get elected are the very ones that work against the programs like living wages and labor rights and unemployment benefits. So here's the question. What are these politicians selling that trump common sense? What is it when the majority of the people on Medicaid expansion are white, but then you vote for people who are going to take it away from you? There was a man just today, he was on TV, you saw him on CNN, he was crying. He said, I voted for Trump because he told me that he was going to take care of my son and going to help us with addiction. Now, Obama passed laws to help more addicted people. What made him disbelieve Obama, who passed the law, and trust Trump, who never passed the law? This is the grown-up question about race. What is it? What mythology is so powerful that it'll make you walk away from the very people you need to be allied with? What mythology is so powerful that it'll allow a wealthy oligarchy who simply wants to get your vote so they can siphon the tax dollars back into their pockets, who have never delivered for poor whites or poor blacks or poor Latinos? What is it that makes you support private schools being funded with public dollars that even after the scholarship, your poor child, even white, will still not be able to go there? What? Where does this come from? Well, y'all remember the Reconstruction movement after 1868, when black and white people came together in deep moral connections? They rewrote all the constitutions in the South. Black and white people working together controlled all the Southern legislature. And because they were people of faith, they raised money to fund public education for everybody. They changed laws to allow men to vote. They started talking about labor rights. In my own state, black and white ministers wrote this to our Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor and the pursuit of happiness. That's 1868. That's two preachers coming together, looking at the scriptures and saying, how can we be better than slavery? But do you also remember that by 1872 there was a response? That the Klan was formed not to go after black people, but to go after white people and scare white people from working with black people? Do you know that a movement came along called themselves the Redemption Movement? And it sounds very spiritual, the Redemption Movement, but they used it to work in ways that are counter to the gospel. And do you know what the basic theme of the Redemption Movement was? Read W.B. Du Bois' book on Black Reconstruction, or Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction. You know what their basic theme was? We got to take back America and make it great again. Go back and read the history. Do you know that in 1876 they came up with a Mississippi plan to retake over the South, because that was 1 year after the 1875 civil rights law that made it a felony to discriminate? Do you know that they didn't win the White House in 1876, but in 1877 a man who did not win the popular vote was given the presidency through the Electoral College, as long as he promised to remove the troops from the South and allow white supremacy to have its way? And do you know that by 1883 they had overtaken the Supreme Court, had changed the laws, had put Jim Crow in place? They voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Then in 1896 you had Plessy versus Ferguson, and through a series of law and order mob campaigns, by 1902 there was no longer one African American in the United States Congress, and the black vote went down. And all of this was blessed by certain churches. Do you remember the Civil Rights Movement? Beginning in 1954 with Plessy, then the death of Emmett Till in 1955, when Emmett Till's mama becomes a prophet by saying, you're going to look at my boy. If you kill him, you're going to look at him. I'm not closing the casket. And then Rosa Parks sees that prophetic move, and she responds to it. She sits down that we might stand up. Martin Luther King does a kind of jazz, mixing Gandhiism, the Beatitudes, the Bible, and social gospel things. Others begin to stand up during that period. I don't have time to do it all. You get the Civil Rights Act, you get the Voting Rights Act, you get fair housing, you get the war on poverty, because black and white and Latinos and Jews and Christians and Muslims are all coming together, and they create a moral force. But then within less than 14 years, you get a backlash. That backlash this time is called the Southern Strategy. Kevin Phillips goes to Richard Nixon and says, I can show you how to win if you just figure out who hates who, who's scared of who, and we're going to play into that. He said, we'll create a Southern strategy where we can control the 13 states from Virginia all the way over to Texas. He said, we're going to make the Republican Party the party of white people in the South. We're going to blackanize the Democratic Party. And then we're going to come up with some Lee Atwater later explains it, so we're going to come up with new ways of talking about race. Race is, we're not going to say the N word. We're going to say tax cuts. Because tax cuts was first raised by the redemption movement in the 1880s because they wanted to cut tax so they could undermine the ability to provide public education to everybody, including black people. So we're going to talk about tax cuts, forced busing, entitlement reform. So all of these things will sound economic things, but the end result is blacks will get hurt worse than whites, and whites will begin to blame their problems on people that they're paying for who are not deserving. And in that way, we're going to turn people against each other. And then we're going to get real slick. We're going to create a moral majority, because we're no longer going to talk about poverty as a moral issue, and civil rights as moral issues, and fair housing as moral issues, and ending war as moral issues. We're going to limit the moral discussion in the public square. Nixon uses that. He wins. Ronald Reagan perfects it in the 1980s with Jerry Falwell. This is the way in which folk have been played against one another over and over and over again. And so what I'm trying to say to you is remember how Samuel said, and I close here, they've done it before. This is not the first time a man has used racism and fear. This is not the first time. It didn't even begin with him. The only thing that should surprise us about this rejection is the ease at which Trumpism was able to adapt it to the 21st century. And the quietness of the church and the unfamiliarity of the media, and they did not know how to critique it. Trump's attacks on immigrants and Muslims and the LGBTQ community were political ploys based on the fundamental fear at the heart of the American experience. This is not an anomaly. What we see happen here is as American as apple pie. And so now, if you know this, we must not waste time asking ourselves how this could have happened. It happened just like it happened in Samuel's day. It's a habit written deep in our public memory. We have racial progress and the progress of racism happening back and forth. And if we're willing to see ourselves as we are, we're going to have to own that this is not un-American. It's a part of the American experience. It's a part of our history. But there's also another part of our history. And that is the Samuels of our history, the prophetic resistance, our potential for revival and resiliency and redemption after rejection. When the prophet Samuel cries out to God in the Old Testament, asking, why have the people elected to follow a strong man rather than the Lord of justice? God replies, it's not you they have rejected, they've rejected me. Those who have struggled against injustice in this country, you must not take the results of this election personally. You must not take the results of what has happened down through the years of America personally. We cannot afford to blame our neighbors or even demonize all the way Mr. Trump, because it is something bigger than him. We must also understand in this moment that we are together inheritors of a legacy that has rejected injustice over and over again. But thank God Almighty, there's also another side of our legacy. And that is that in a sense we kind of bipolar, thank you Lord. We are also the heirs of great dissenters who stood for right even when they were a minority of one, who found ways to be resilient and to be revived even when rejected. When the Jim Crow law of the Solid South was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, only one justice, Justice Harlan, a Christian man out of Kentucky, dissented. But his dissenting opinion laid the groundwork for Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall to eventually win Brown versus Board of Education. Oh yes, you talk about Steve Bannon being in the White House, but don't forget that when Woodrow Wilson was president, he was a governor and the president of Princeton University. He put Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office, the first movie with sound to be played. It distorted the Reconstruction. It lied. It claimed that black elected officials of the 18th and 19th century were bad, and that the white ones that participated with them participated in a rigged election. But right in the midst of that, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary Wright Overton, the first white executive director of the NAACP, they challenged him. They didn't stay rejected. They got up. They were resilient and they were redemptive. Don't you remember when 3 civil rights workers were brutally murdered in the first days of Freedom Summer? The black and white students did not choose to run, but instead they pressed on together. They went right back to Mississippi's brutal racism because they believed they could change the world. And their mentor, Fannie Lou Hamer, taught them. She said, I'm 5 foot inches 4. I might die, but I'm gonna die falling forward, because there comes a time when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. To that rejection last year, which is American as apple pie, we now must become the moral defibrillators of our own selves. You heard me talk a little bit about that. We've got to apply the defibrillator to our own self. Put your hand on your heart and say, it's time to be revived. It's time for us to be more determined to stand for love and justice and mercy. It's time for us to be the Samuels right now. Less than a majority of Americans elected a mortal. They did not elect a God. God is still on the throne. Yeah. I come by here to tell you, some things might have been rejected, but they didn't unelect the Constitution. They didn't unelect the great moral convictions of our faith. Yes, some things happen, but there's still plenty to work with. And right now, this poisonous, toxic, and intoxicating brew of racism and classism was once again ingested into our national reality. But we've got to stand now. We who are sober must understand you were not unelected. And you were not rejected by God. You are a child of God. You are the prophetic witnesses. I've stopped by to tell you, Fannie Lou Hamer is not getting up. Harriet Tubman is not getting up. Rosa Parks is not getting up. Dorothy Day is not getting up. Rabbi Heschel is not getting up. Malcolm is not getting up. Mega is not getting up. And I know Frederick is not getting up because I just was at his grave a few months ago. But you are their children. You are the Samuels of this generation. You are the ones that America needs right now. Hallelujah. Yeah. The world is drunk with the wine of the world, defying the wine of the Spirit, the wine of justice, the wine of love. Strong men are offering hope all around the world. But we've got to build these moral, interracial coalitions. We cannot forget the lessons that the dark past has taught us and the faith that has brought us. We've got to be the Samuel. We've got to, even this president, we've got to challenge him. Maybe we got to always believe in the possibility of redemption, even if it doesn't happen. And if it doesn't challenge, we got to call him to repent. And sometimes it's going to mean getting arrested. Sometimes it's going to mean organizing at the state level. It's going to mean those of you at the religious school, you got to take some of your religion in the street. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I'd tell you that. Yeah. God got him straight. Samuel, it's not you. It's not you. It's not you. And he told Saul that, Saul, Saul, I really don't want you here. Listen to Samuel talking to Saul. I really don't want you here. And I don't like what's going on, but I'm still God's prophet. Samuel went and anointed Saul. He didn't want to anoint him. He said, I'm going to put my hands on you, but I'm not putting my hands on you because I like you. I'm putting my hands on you so you'll know God is still around. Lord have mercy. I'm putting my hands on you to remind you, you might be a king, but you ain't bigger than God. I'm putting my hands on you to let you know every time you do wrong, according to the mercy and love of God, I'm going to be here to check you, as the young folks say. I'm telling you the truth. We have to be the ones that say America, like Langston Hughes, has never been America to us. But we're going to swear this oath that America will be. So I still believe that we can change some things. I still believe I was born August 30th, 1963, 2 days after the March on Washington. Who would have, my mama said that I was kind of rambunctious, so she went into labor on the 28th, and I said, hold up, there's some white folk and black folk marching, stop jobs and justice, let's see what happens here. And they got a gay man organizing it. For all y'all that love King, you can't love him without loving Bayard Rustin. Yeah. And I said, let's see what happened. And they came 250,000 people. Yeah, and then I was born. And then 17 days later, Rejection. 4 girls got blown up in a Birmingham church. And then less than 2 months later, or 3 months later, a president gets killed. And it all started with a governor from Alabama with his words that February when he got inaugurated, saying segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But what did they do? They kept pushing. Young folk got together and said, since they're killing us, we go on to Freedom Summer 64. And Dr. King went to Selma, even when Johnson told him not to go. Nuns came down there. When they tell me some of the bishops told them not to go, they broke ranks, and Jews came together, and they went down there. And I still believe we can build. That's why on April the 2nd, at the anniversary of the Time to Break Silence message that Dr. King preached in 1967, I'm going to preach at Riverside, and with other preachers make a call that we need a national moral revival, poor people's, poor children campaign. We need another campaign. We need to get off the defense and get on the offense. Yeah, we need a new narrative. We need a moral narrative. We need to stop talking about left and right and conservative versus liberal and start talking about what's right and what's wrong. And on April the 3rd, we're going to do an audit with some of the best economists in the country and the world, audit America since '68 on race and class and judgment. If you're interested in it, you go check Repairers of the Breach. I hope some of you will join. And then next year, we're not going to have any more what they call them, not consecrations, commemorations where they did so much back then. No, in 2018, it's time 50 years later to finish the march that Dr. King started. He was killed. But it's time. And what if, I'm just wondering, maybe the Candler School of, what y'all call yourself, Candler School of Theology, is that right? Maybe the Candler School of Theology might want to hook up with some other places in Georgia, and maybe you all would want to be the organizing ground for the group that's going to march on the Capitol right here in Atlanta. And what if we had 30 states for 2 or 3 weeks where people went in every day and had civil disobedience around a clear, higher ground, a moral agenda, and calling on folk to do right by the poor and to address the issues of racism and classism and continuing militarism. And what if at the same time that was happening in the state, it was happening in D.C., so that they could say, well, Reverend Barber, we don't understand how all of this is happening. I say, well, because Samuel is like Bebe's kid. He just multiplies, multiplies all over. There ain't no one leader anymore. It's about the prophets that are right here in Georgia standing up and taking your place. It's about understanding that your governor should not be comfortable in this state if you're here. Not with a school of theology here. The governor should not be comfortable hurting the poor and hurting the sick. Not in Georgia. My God. That's why one of my favorite passages of scripture is that Psalm 118 that says the stones that the builders rejected have now become the chief cornerstone. In other words, God can use the rejected. Wish I had a witness here. God can use the rejected to produce revival and produce redemption. And I know in this room there are some of you who've known rejection. You've been rejected because of your sexuality. You've been rejected because of who you love. You've been rejected because of how you were born. You've been rejected because you needed somebody. Somebody been rejected because of your income. You've been rejected because your faith or your lack of faith. You've been rejected because of racism. You've been rejected because of where you come from. You've been rejected. But I want you to know God has a special ministry for the rejected. The stones that the builders rejected are now the cornerstones of building a new consciousness in America. And I want you to know that when the rejected get together, they can redeem this country from hate and discrimination. When hands that once picked cotton join Latino hands, and they join white hands, and they join faith hands, and they join labor hands, and they join Asian hands, and they join Native American hands, and they join poor hands, and they join Christian hands, and they join Muslim hands, and they join Black Lives hands, and they join Fight for 15 hands, and they join gay hands, and they join straight hands. When all the rejected get together, we become instruments of redemption that will guarantee that we will not stop being Samuel until this is one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. When we all get together, when we all get together, when we all get together, what a day, what a day, what a day of justice it will be.